Good morning. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Lerner. I lead Facebook's effort to support organizations and individuals that work to advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. I really enjoyed the first session between Catherine and Lorena this morning, and I took tons of notes, and I had my two little girls here kind of getting ready to go to school. And I was like, this is important, girls. We've got to tune in and listen here. So this is an intra-generational homeschooling, remote work, crazy world we're all in. But really happy to see all of you. And I took note of, there were people from Ghana, a fellow Mainer, some people tuning in from Tanzania, Malaysia, all of the US. Yeah, so welcome. I'm so honored and happy that you're all here with us today. It's a big day in the world. And yeah, let's get started. So early on, when I joined Facebook at about 3 years ago after working many years in Southern Africa and at the World Bank with ICTs and data and disruptive technology. And so early on when I arrived and we sat down to develop a strategy to what we call meaningfully contribute to the UN global goals. I guess coming from the World Bank, I was really into like, we got to do this systematically. So let's map everything that Facebook does that contributes to the SDGs. And then we also spent some time thinking about the interconnectedness of the goals. Does some goals impact others more? Is there sort of one or two key goals that we could kind of just emphasize and solve everything? Obviously, there isn't. But we did realize that one of the most unique and impactful ways that we could contribute as Facebook, recognizing who we are as a company, and particularly the reach that we have, was to invest in gender data. Almost 3 billion people use Facebook services each month, and about half of that group is women. So that's a massive number of women using some of our services. I would say that this gives us a unique understanding and insights into the lives of women and sometimes the needs of women, as well as a unique responsibility to find ways to safely share these insights with organizations that are representing these women or that work directly to improve their lives and opportunities. Very briefly, we work in 3 ways to do this. So we work to generate new gender data, for example, through what we call the Gender Equality Survey that we run in partnership with Ladysmith, for example, and World Bank and others. We also make existing data and data collection efforts less gender blind. This one example is what we're going to talk about today, where we're helping to visualize how integrating gender data shows new and important patterns around issues that we might have not known had we not been thoughtful about inclusion of gender data. And then thirdly, we try to make better use of existing data by building capacity, building local capacity and organizational capacity. A lot of this work we've actually done in partnership with Tech Change. So I feel like we're here among friends. The panel objectives of today is twofold. One, we want to showcase some practical examples and applications of gender data, which actually links nicely to the principle that Lorena and Catherine brought up earlier this morning. Let's not just collect data for the sake of collecting, but actually let's make sure it's useful for someone and that it brings out some new insights that people can take action around. And the second one is to consider considerations and learnings for the steps around the gender data lifecycle. Tech Change has a really great Gender Data 101 course for people who are interested in learning more about that. But I'm thrilled to be here among 3 experts who can talk directly to the work with the gender data lifecycle. So on the panel, we have Melissa Prasad, who is the Director of New Business and Global Development at Frame. We have Alicia Leon Molina, who is a social data analyst at CityBeats, and Andrew Schroeder, who is the Vice President of Research and Analytics at Direct Relief. We will start with Melissa. So Melissa, I would love for you to present yourself when you start, and also think about, hold on, I lost my notes. There we go. And also think about why spatial data is so important for understanding these data gaps. Over to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Again, my name is Melissa Persad. I am the Director of New Business for Global Development at Frame. So I look after our global development portfolio broadly. At Frame, we are a geospatial data and analytics company where we leverage our technology and software to generate spatial insights, understanding how communities differ 1 square kilometer at a time across a number of population characteristics. So a few months ago, we engaged with Facebook and with Project 17 to take a look at some of the data that that Facebook produced on gender equality in the home to better understand some of the potential spatial distributions for food security across men and women. So to look at the gender gap, one community at a time. We can go to the next slide. The next slide, please. So some estimates say that 9 out of 10 Nigerians are food insecure. But the reality is that the magnitude of food insecurity differs both based on location and based on who you are and how you make a living. So we tackled this challenge by taking a look at the Facebook data from the Survey on Gender Equality in the Home to understand what the magnitude of the potential gender gap is in food security. And that data showed a 7 percentage point difference between men and women of who is most food insecure, women being 7 percentage points higher than men. This is still a national statistic, and what we aimed to do together is to leverage Frame's expertise in producing subnational data to see if we could identify a viable technique for identifying spatial differences in the gender gap in food security in Nigeria. So what we're looking at on the right is a map of Nigeria using Facebook's high resolution population density mapping for Nigeria. And we are looking at the 86% statistic for women being food insecure in the country. So were we to apply these two together, the heat map would look very similar, right? You're looking at an 86% of all women, no matter where you are, being food insecure. The output of our effort after looking at some weighting techniques is a heat map on the right, where we're able to see the spatial differences of women who are food insecure weighted by a factor of undernutrition. And so here you start to see the magnitude of the issue for women specifically, and then we'll move to the next slide to tell you how we did that. Our biggest input, in addition to the Facebook data sets on population density and the food security for women, was to look at a weighting factor of children who are facing undernutrition. There's the weighting factor here is part of Frame's database, which is produced using secondary data sets like the DHS, the LSMS, and other household surveys, and weaving together satellite imagery and remotely sensed data to give you this high resolution visual and quantification of undernutrition. So we looked at this as a sex disaggregated data set as well, and weighted female population with female undernourishment, and similarly for male and male. We can go to the next slide. The output here is now a heat map of the differences. So in the first maps we looked at, we were able to see where there were women who were facing varying issues in food security. But here we're actually looking at, women and men as a comparison, and what you're looking at in the map is a gap. So the blues being areas where men are more food insecure and where there is no gap, and then a heat map where we're moving into the reds, where we're seeing women being making up a higher concentration of food insecurity and a larger percentage point of the difference. So we're moving from a 7 percentage point gap to over 25 percentage points in some communities. Now, our methods are an initial effort here, and and I think that there's a lot of room for improvement on where we could go in terms of weighting to understand these gender gaps for any issue being faced, in terms of development and the SDGs. But the output here is a heat map that I think is quite actionable in identifying communities where there are potentially the most significant gender gaps in food security. And we can use this to inform qualitative and more timely quantitative data collection to validate the efforts, and then also to start to take action. But I think that at the end of the day, this is a tool in our toolkit to draw attention to some of the larger issues that are facing women and men differently from a spatial perspective, so we can see one community at a time how they are similar or different. We can stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. This is really interesting. And it's, I love how you were able to kind of go from, top line sort of national level. Obviously, Nigeria, massive country, massive differences in region, and then really drill deeper down and uncover actually maybe like findings that we hadn't expected to see, right? From kind of the look of the eye, it looks like men are actually more food insecure across Nigeria, if you look just kind of at the color differences in many regions. So that's fascinating. We were surprised when we did the gender equality survey at home in 2020. We surveyed around 200 countries, and I want to say the survey took place in 80 languages, and it was about 500,000 people who answered. We saw really big numbers indicating that food insecurity was a substantial problem across rich and poor countries. I'm Swedish, and I was surprised to see that sort of in the mid-20s, percentage of women actually expressed concerns around food security, even in Sweden. So certainly this year has been complicated, and I think analysis like this and other work that Frame is doing is really helpful in trying to visualize some of these insights and helping organizations to take action. I have a quick question for you before we move over to Alicia and City Beats. Can you tell us a little bit more about who uses these insights? Frame obviously is an analytics company and does really good work for a lot of clients and partners, but can you just kind of, for those people who don't know about Frame, who uses this?
It's a great question, and I think we're producing data products for a number of stakeholders. So we have partners who are taking this type of data and going directly to implementation. So they know generally where they're going to operate, but are able to target their finite resources to these specific communities that are identified as the biggest unmet need, and also to layer services. So often we're looking at development challenges in complex areas where there are multiple issues happening at the same time, right? Food security is a symptom of many other things in many cases. And other gender-related issues are often inflamed by other issues in the community. And so our implementing partners are informing which interventions are rolled out in which communities in the order in which they are needed based on some of the data that we're producing. We're also working directly with foundations and donors who are making some of those more strategic portfolio-wide decisions. So who are looking at the entire country, like Nigeria, and prioritizing where investments are needed, or matching their donor resources to the biggest unmet need, and informing some of the policy decisions that government stakeholders are considering in the kind of development landscape. And then the last is for advocacy, and that's where I think this type of analysis is really starting to could play a large role, is to say, in theory, we have the general understanding there are spatial differences across any data set, that communities differ, but having a map that shows exactly where those are, or where there's the biggest issue and the severity of the issue, is really impactful for non-data savvy folks to really draw your attention in and say, oh, this is a community that I know. It's near a home, it's near family, and connecting the dots in terms of who, of storytelling and drawing the attention to an issue.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I think Andrew will actually build upon that narrative a little bit later on as well. He's done a lot of work in that space. First, I will move over to City Beats, and Alicia, will you please tell us a little bit more about what you've been working on?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. So, hello everyone. I'm Alicia Leon from City Beats, and well, first of all, I would say that I'm very excited to participate in such a great event, and especially on a day like today, where it is very important to continue fighting for women's rights. A little bit about me: I'm a statistician specialized in data analysis applied to social research projects. Specifically, I'm specializing my career in gender responsive data analysis and the analysis of gender issues to help eradicate gender inequalities through data. 8 months ago, I started working on City Beats as a social data analyst, where my mission is to give value to the data we work with, analyzing it and extracting knowledge and information for policymakers. So that's a brief introduction of myself. And now I'm going to talk about a project that we have carried out from City Beats, working with gender disaggregated data from Facebook and MIT. As we all know, there are still gender gaps in many areas of life where women live worse situations because they are women. And having visibility on gender differences can help to have knowledge about the situation of health decision making to improve the existing gender gap in many areas of society. In addition, the exceptional situation that we are experiencing with the COVID-19 pandemic can aggravate these inequalities, and it is more necessary than ever work on it, relying on data to avoid a greater incidence in the lives of half of the population. After this introduction, the points that I will briefly cover through my presentation, first of all, I'm going to explain a little bit what is City Beats. Then I'm going to give you some context of a project where we have incorporated this analysis with Facebook data. Then I will talk about the analysis of Facebook and the main conclusions with this analysis. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit some extra analysis we did with our technology. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, let's start. What is City Beats? City Beats is an ethical AI text analytics platform on a mission to power a responsive society by distilling opinions and making them actionable. The City Beats platform is used to transform unstructured opinions data into analyzed, aggregated, and actionable data. Unlike other text analysis platforms focused on brand monitoring, City Beats is specialized in social understanding, giving voice to citizens' opinions for decision-making, working with organizations such as the World Health Organization, Inter-American Development Bank, or the United Nations. By collecting unstructured data and processing it with AI techniques, we obtain different outputs, such as real-time alerts that surfaces data anomalies, relevant clusters, and on-demand cluster monitoring, and leading indicators that create social signals, which tell us what will change before you see it in the traditional methods, or social indexes that provide us stable information, such as level of trust in government from citizens. Taking into account the gender perspective from City Beats, we work to use our technology to help improve the situation of women around the world with some concrete actions. For example, calibrating gender bias in our online data, analyzing gender issues and including the gender perspective in all the projects, or working in an inclusive and feminist company culture. In this context, we have developed a specific area called FemBeats, where we work on different initiatives to include the gender perspective in the daily life of City Beats, from our projects to the generation of feminist awareness. So going to the next slide, I'm going to explain a little bit how are we using all of this in the real world. In the COVID-19 context, we have powered the EARS platform with WHO, which is the early AI-supported response with social listening, where the purpose is to listen to people's questions and concerns in order to learn about what matters to communities and in response to COVID-19 and provide useful information to health authorities. In this portal, data is collected and analyzed daily, and there are more than 13 million of online opinions analyzed since December 15, 2020, with 20 countries covered and tracking 39 topics around COVID-19. The website is having visitors from all over the world, and the main users of this tool are the health ministers that will use the platform in the management of COVID-19 infodemic. And here you can see a little demonstration of what the website looks like. Going to the next slide, we are returning to the project in question that we have worked on the analysis that we have called Visualizing Invisible Women, exposing inequalities using gender data and analyzing women's voices on the Whoever's platform. And what is this project about? Here, the CTVs used Facebook and MIT COVID-19 survey data and online conversations from the Whoever's platform to analyze gender inequalities and provide actionable information on the situation of women during pandemic. The analysis is focused on the gender differences related with COVID-19 vaccine demand, with the objective of providing information on how women and men are accepting the vaccine and reveal possible gender differences that could help decision-making in the public health response against the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, this provides useful information to the national ministries of health and offers a tool to support decision-making. For maximum visibility and impact, we have included these interactive visuals are you seeing on the slide on the public website I was talking about years. In this chart shows gender disaggregated data about the acceptance of COVID-19 vaccine from July 6, 2020 to January 17, 2021 in 11 countries around the world. It represents the percentage of women and men who say they will get the vaccine, those who say they wouldn't get it, and those who say they are undecided. So going to the next slide, after executing this analysis, the main finding was that women have a higher undecided rate in all countries for all waves. As well, the latest data shows a greater rejection of the vaccine by women in many countries. Consequently, the greatest acceptance is concentrated in men. The results denote more vulnerability of women to the end of the health crisis, taking into account that the vaccine is not a mandatory measure and it will depend on the decision of each person to take it or not. With this first analysis, going to the next slide, please. Thanks to the survey data, it was possible to identify the gender gap on the vaccine acceptance. After identifying the problem, the EARS platform was used to better understand the citizen perceptions about the COVID-19 vaccine, and the following insights were observed. For example, in Colombia and Nigeria, conversations about myths related to the vaccine are more present among women. In India, women concentrate more proportion of conversations than men around the evidence and scientific process of the vaccine. And in France, this information about the COVID-19 vaccine is more present in the conversations of women. So far, that's our presentation. We would like to thank Facebook for making us participate in this project and for getting involved in social problems, as well as Natalia and all the team from the Tech Change for organizing this wonderful event. And just say that in the near future, we hope that different organizations and data sources can continue to collaborate to join forces in the face of social inequalities and gender issues. And this is all from me. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alicia. That's really interesting. It's fascinating how you can pick up on those differences using these different tools that you have. I remember one of the earlier conversations I've had with City Beats, it must have been probably 2 years ago now, when your team was mapping essentially how different people around the world, gender disaggregated, obviously, felt about the SDGs. So you could kind of see that women in certain countries cared more about some SDGs and men in other countries cared about others, which is also really kind of referring back to what Melissa talked about. That's an interesting instrument and valuable input to, for example, donors or community organizations or foundations when they think about, what should we invest in country X? Well, then you can use that sort of insight into what people seem to talk a lot about and be interested in, and focus your investments that way. I just had one question before we're going to hand over to Andrew. In general, you at CityBeats, you're combining a lot of different data. How do you think survey data and public data should work together? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So yeah, survey data has traditionally been used as a scanner of society on various issues, but these methodologies, like many others, have their limitations. So with the appearance of big data, we have a very rich data sources that can help us understand the interest of society in a more spontaneous way and provide large amount of data. As we have seen with this use case, both data sources complement each other very well, where the data from a survey have been able to detect an existing gender gap, and in this case of the acceptance of the vaccine, and through big data it can be analyzed more in depth what is behind this gender gap, better understanding citizens and extracting actionable insights for policymakers, as we were talking. So yeah, in summary, I would say that it's important that analysis continue to be developed with multiple data sources to give insights to specific problems, focusing especially on the problem and observing in each case which methodologies can provide us a better vision.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. I'll hand over now to Andrew Schroeder. Direct Relief is one of the oldest, longest standing partners for Facebook's Data for Good work. So I know that you have a lot of experience in mashing up these type of different data sets and making them highly actionable for frontline organizations. I also just want to thank you because part of that work that you've done throughout the years is also feeding back, giving us feedback on what's working, what data sets are not working, what should we go for next, what are people using and what isn't so helpful, which is really valuable for somewhat detached large tech companies like ourselves. So thanks for that.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on with all of you. It's just really brilliant work, I think, from the first two folks that presented as well. Just a little bit of background on Direct Relief and the context here, since we're a little bit of a different kind of organization. Direct Relief is a nonprofit organization that focuses on humanitarian medical relief, particularly in supply chain and support for healthcare programs throughout the world. So I'm going to talk about the United States in this context, and particularly about issues around disaster displacement, post-disaster displacement, which I really think Facebook has done an extraordinary job, I think, leading in gender disaggregation of data about how people and communities are displaced following disaster. And just a note, this is work that focuses on the Gulf Coast in California. I'm really only going to talk about the Gulf Coast, but I'll say a couple words at the end, just at a high level about California, because it's an instructive difference. Next slide. So just to highlight a couple of key issues as to why this is such an important topic, I think. We know that as extreme weather events mount around the world, displacement per se is a significant issue. We're focused particularly around healthcare, and so I think healthcare issues pertinent to women and men are kind of at the forefront of our consciousness. But we want to be able to understand the most specific forms of support that can be offered, and so we're interested in whether gender differences make a difference in terms of where people are likely to be displaced, how long they're displaced, and what the consequences of that displacement are. So just a couple of key issues. One is around longstanding, and I'm thinking here particularly about the United States, but really elsewhere as well. Wage and wealth differentials also tend to follow gender inequalities, which tends to affect the resources that people have at their disposal to be displaced. Single mothers in particular have significant responsibilities and inequalities in post-disaster situations, much following along regular situations. That reflects food insecurity questions. It reflects questions around access to healthcare, including mental health care, which often is not necessarily treated as a frontline disaster issue, but increasingly has become so. There's issues that have been flagged for many years, but recent events are no different around gender-based violence in post-disaster situations where people are at their most vulnerable when they're long-term displaced from their homes. And one of the long-standing concerns for direct relief is around equitable provision of maternal and child health care as people face issues of access and in particular issues of long-term displacement. That's both for safe delivery and for neonatal care, for postnatal care, for the entire range of access to obstetric services, all of which are impacted significantly by displacement and crisis events. So this is why it's sort of a frontline question for us in terms of thinking about displacement. Next slide. In this case, a couple of key data sources, and I won't talk about all these, but just really want to top level flag the post-disaster displacement data. Facebook has been looking at mobility of population for some time now. This is how I was first exposed to data in the Data for Good program at Facebook. And this is data looking, in this case, at long-term displacement. So the duration of time in a post-disaster situation that someone would spend outside of their home, away from their immediate home area. And they've worked with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center and others to be able to disaggregate that based on men and women. And the results, I think, are interesting and surprising in a number of ways, although not actually entirely consistent. And I think one of the key kind of intersecting factors, which reflects back even on some of the issues I was talking about a minute ago, has to do with questions around relative wealth. Where disasters happen makes a big difference in terms of whether or not you see a significant gap. I mean, our hypothesis really ought to be that men and women are affected equally by crisis events in some ways, given that the housing stock, for instance, is affected in relatively common ways by say, flooding events, et cetera. But this is not necessarily the case. And in fact, actually, we can see recent examples where there are actually quite dramatic differences in terms of the degree to which women are more likely to be affected by displacement than men. Do you want to go forward? And forward again. So this is going to be focusing particularly around recent Gulf Coast hurricanes. This is looking at Hurricane Laura, which hit the US Gulf Coast in late August of last year. There was a succession of hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast. It was a particularly active year. And if we look at the entire region, click forward, you can see this gap between women in the orange line versus men being more likely to be displaced overall. And that is a larger gap at the beginning. It narrows as you kind of go forward. The rate of return, as you can see up above, expands over time. So women, as we go forward, tend to return to their homes somewhat faster than men. This follows the normalized data in terms of population normalized to overall. Interesting, though, when we look at the proportion that are displaced abroad, which means that they had the resources to leave the country altogether, the dynamic flips, actually, so that men are much more likely to be displaced abroad than women. This actually follows trends that have been observed in the literature around post-disaster displacement for some time, which focuses really on the differences in resources that men and women have, and also it really focuses in on family responsibilities, and men, particularly men that may not have family responsibilities, tend to tend to travel much longer distances to get out of disaster situations. Next slide. So this gets much more dramatic, actually, when we focus in on the most affected area of the Hurricane Laura impact zone. So the area of Calcasieu Parish, which is where the city of Lake Charles, Louisiana is located, was dramatically more affected than the rest of the region by the events overall. Over 8,000 houses were destroyed. Tens of thousands of people were displaced from this event, and the gender gap is dramatically larger in this particular case. Similarly, the displaced abroad, although the numbers overall are so low for both men and women, there was very few people that were displaced abroad at all. Lake Charles is a relatively poorer area than the surrounding area, particularly when compared to Houston, Texas, to the west, and to Baton Rouge and New Orleans to the east. It's inland, and is in that case relatively poorer than the surrounding area. Can you click forward? Just at the high level, the numbers are well outside of what the baseline population is. So if given that in this particular population sample there was a gender distinction in the underlying population sample for the user base, but the population difference for the displaced, particularly at the start of that period where the distinction is greatest, it narrows over time. But at the start of that period, the distinction is 7% higher for women, 7% more likely to be displaced by disaster in the Calcasieu area, which is the most affected area in that case. Can you click forward? Again, this is reflected in this likelihood to be displaced abroad, where the distinction flips. So again, men are in this sample much more likely to be displaced abroad than women, which reflects these resource questions. Click forward. And if we look in at the wind swath area, so we can see the intensity of the wind that affected the areas, the counties in this case, and select for the counties that were most adversely affected. Well over half of those counties are in the bottom half of the relative wealth index. This gets more disproportionate as we click into count at the municipal levels, where it follows along rural urban divides, where there's a significant proportion of rural poverty in these areas, especially and what you might call para-urban poverty around the outskirts of places like Lake Charles. And these are areas where the gender distinctions also escalate. So this combination of low areas of relative wealth, the geography in this case being that the most physically impacted areas were also the relatively poorest areas, tended to produce an outsized impact upon women as opposed to men in this area. I should note just at a high level, although we don't have time to go into it, that this was not the case in California for the wildfires. So the gender dynamics were in many ways flipped, especially as you went into more wealthy areas of the Bay Area and areas in Northern California, where we had wildfire displacement. Wildfire is also a somewhat different type of displacement, and tends to not be as long-lived. People tend to return from wildfires much faster. But as you go into higher income areas in Northern California, you don't actually tend to see these gender distinctions. You see something closer to what we would see as the null hypothesis here, which is that men and women are affected equally. But as you line these up in particular locations, we can detect outsized distinctions, and this can then also drive resource allocation and healthcare planning for people that are affected post-disaster, so that we can be most responsive to their needs when they're in their times of greatest vulnerability. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Ender. I have a quick question for you. But I would also wanted to take the opportunity to ask everyone that's listening in to please field your questions now for the Q&A section for everyone on the panel in the chat window. And I'm getting access to all those questions, so please drop them in there, and I'll pass them on to the panelists. First, though, Andrew, what was the main challenge to your team capturing all of these insights? And also, maybe this is not so short of an answer, but how do you balance the kind of supply and demand dynamics here? You need a lot of data to make this useful, but you also need recipients and people who are lined up to take action on these data. And what do you do to kind of harmonize that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, so to take the second point first, so we work with a range of community health center actors. We have longstanding networks in the region, and in many ways, we've been working on similar issues like this for a long time. This is not the high level conclusions are not really new, and we've been acting according to gender distinctions post disaster for a while. What's different is the ability to measure it. Actually, I think this is Facebook's real contribution in the space is to be able to contribute the ability to be precise about measurement, and then to look at how that might actually affect the geography. So like we were saying, it's not universally true that women are disproportionately affected, but it is very true in certain areas. And so having those kinds of networks in place, where we're already working with healthcare providers that are providing a range of services for women's healthcare. We're working with the shelter system. We can help to inform people that are operating the shelter system. We can help to inform people that are, deploying emergency medical teams to say, actually, this is not a kind of uniform crisis. In these areas, emergency medical teams actually probably ought to pay more attention to healthcare issues that would affect women as opposed to men. And in these areas, it might be less true. I think that's really been kind of at the forefront of our concerns. In terms of the difficulties with the analysis, I mean, I really think the main issue has been speed versus data flow. So, in order to do emergency response, we have to be able to do this kind of analysis. I mean, we have a little bit of a luxury, although I did a version of this analysis back in August, actually, and September, since it takes about 2 weeks for the data to come through. So we have to do this really fast in order to be able to inform people in those contexts. And I think having data pipelines in place, having familiarity with the data, having the ability to have methods and other kinds of scripting flows that are built so that we can have a smooth transition from data publication all the way to insight and application is really at the forefront of how we're thinking about this. And there's a lot more work to do on that. And we need, some support on being able to do more of that well. But being able to do analysis in real time is, I think, becoming increasingly important. And Facebook has really, I think, been helping us out at the forefront of that to publish data that's valuable immediately.
Great, that's super helpful. Good to know. Thank you. I have two questions here from Melissa, actually, from Jasleen. So I'll combine them. But the first question is, what's your definition of food security? So what was the underlying question to answer the build a data set around food security? And the second one, which is linked, is, do you think COVID-19 had something to do with the exaggerated differences in food security among men and women? The data set was collected in 2020, so basing a map on that year to make future policy decisions might be somewhat biased. That was from Melissa.
Sure. Hi. So two things. In this analysis, we used a number of different indicators, which is part of the challenge in working with the data sets that are publicly or semi-publicly available. So the Facebook survey on gender equality in the home asked about your food security in the last 30 days. And yes, this was during COVID. So I actually think there's a benefit to some of the more recent data that's been collected that is supplemental to the kind of gold standard household survey that is conducted every 1 to 5 years, depending on the country. Where we were able to augment the data sets and how we weighted was actually using some of the inputs from that household survey. So looking at child undernutrition, looked at a number of indicators, the caloric intake per day for a child, stunting measures, so height and weight, and it actually created a composite layer. So it's a number of nutrition related indicators for girls and boys for that weighting factor. And that measure is about more chronic food insecurity, whereas the Facebook data set is a bit of more of an acute food insecurity measure, both of which have value and both of which measure something very specific. And we used a chronic measure as the weighting factor to, one, try to adjust for some of the COVID abnormalities, but two, it actually provides that visual and weighting factor for the more persistent issue that could be addressed through policy decisions that may take a little bit longer to take action rather than immediate response, which would require that kind of acute food security, distribute funds and food packages like immediately. And so what we were trying to do is unpack the spatial differences using an imperfect approach. I think our data scientists and analysts are very honest in that we want to, there's more work to be done here, but our main objective was to say there are spatial differences in gender gaps and in sex disaggregated data, just as much as there are in non-sex disaggregated data. So our ethos is there are data sets that are aggregated and you mask a lot of differences. You mask the differences one community at a time, and you mask the difference in experience based on your gender.
That's great. That's super helpful. Thank you. Alicia, I have a question here from Julia. She asked, there are a number of different COVID-19 vaccines out there using different vaccine platforms. To which did the analysis relate that you spoke of?
Thank you, Anna. So our analysis, both with data from Facebook and with the EARS platform, wasn't focused on any of the vaccines in particular, but on the COVID vaccine in general, and trying to capture mentions to the vaccine in general and to the different kind of vaccines they are now they are using. But without a doubt, it would be very interesting to analyze the impressions on the different vaccines currently available. I thought for now we haven't focused on any in particular.
Great, that's helpful. I have a follow-up question to you also, Alicia. Early on when we set out to do work on gender data at Facebook, we worked with Ladysmith. We actually worked with Ladysmith throughout as a mix of an advisor and kind of partner in a lot of different initiatives that we've worked on. And they came out with these set of recommendations for tech companies. I'll see if one of my colleagues is able to drop the link to that report in the chat for all of you to also see it. But it was a set of really good recommendations that if you're a tech company or a startup or some other type of private sector actor and wants to engage in the gender space and gender data particularly, what can you do? Like, what are some good practices or recommendations? And one of the things that they highlighted, which we try to incorporate as much as we can, is to really bring feminist researchers and feminist organizations around the table. I think about these when we look at when we do analysis around perceptions, particularly around a field like vaccine hesitancy or so on. It's so important to get to the local nuances, like what words are they using and how are they expressing concerns or excitement around that is often very local. When you do these analyses, these large scale sort of global impulse of data sets and create these indexes or kind of confidence grids, do you work with local organizations or some kind of social impact partners when you create these definitions and results?
Thank you, Anna, for your question. So yeah, we are always trying to take that into consideration, of course. With this role, well, I'm social data analyst and I have some other colleagues. So part of our role as is in every project we work on is trying to have a very good context on the area we are analyzing the data and trying to have this knowledge to give that knowledge to our algorithms to take into account all these inclusive things at the time of doing analysis. And as well for us, it's very important to work with our clients that the most of the time they have some very good context on the country or cities we are working on, and trying to as well have their knowledge into our analysis and our setup of our projects to have all these things into consideration.
That's great. Thank you so much. We are out of time, so I'm going to wrap up knowing that there's some really exciting workshops that will follow right after this that we all need to log on and log in back into. So I need to do that. I need to set myself up here. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation. I'm fascinated by the topic. Sometimes it feels like, oh, this is so hard. How do we do this right in a responsible way, making sure we represent everyone properly, protect people, women in particularly, obviously. At the same time, it just feels so important, and it feels like this is the right thing to do. And for myself as a woman, as a mom, I just want to thank the three of you for dedicating your professional abilities and capabilities to kind of fight for the rights and opportunities of women, particularly by using data, because I think it's such a critical component of everything that we do. So thank you so much. Really appreciate the partnership we've had over the last couple of months, and hope to do a lot more with all of you going forward. And for anyone that's still tuning in, we're always on the lookout of interesting examples where we visualize the differences amongst men and women. I think it's really important as kind of to remind the world that gender data is important. We need to show them why it's important. So if you're listening and you have some interesting examples that you want to share with us, we would be happy to take a look and see what we can do for that. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, we are